December 1944. The world is on fire. In Europe, German tanks claw through the Ardennes in one last gamble. In the Pacific, kamikazes slam into American carriers. Across oceans, 1 billion lives hang in the balance. And yet, on the other side of the world, the United States glows like a furnace. From the air, the continent itself looks alive. Streaks of orange and white light tracing the arteries of war. Detroit, Pittsburgh, Seattle, Los Angeles, each city a different organ of the same industrial body. The smokestacks of Bethlehem Steel, the shipyards of San Francisco, the bomber lines at Willow Run, all burning through the night. It's 3 a.m. in Michigan. The Ford plant hums like a beehive. The air trembles with the pounding of presses stamping out bomber frames. Women in coveralls wipe the sweat from their faces and keep working. Someone laughs. Someone coughs. No one stops. In Chicago, rail yards thunder with the sound of cargo. Oil, ammo, food, steel. 10,000 trains a day. Every line headed toward a coast. Every cargo marked for war. America never sleeps now. This is the arsenal of democracy at full power. The largest industrial surge in human history. It doesn't fight battles, it feeds them. The numbers defy belief. $250 million spent every day. 50,000 factories running at full speed. More than 2 million men and women working through the night shifts, building bombers, tanks, and rations in the same rhythm as breathing. It is the night the lights never went out, because the free world couldn't afford darkness. In one corner of a Pennsylvania steel mill, a worker named Helen Carter writes a single line in her diary before her next shift. "We make the metal that holds the world together." She's right. Every rivet, every weld, every bolt connects to a front line half a world away. The engine built in Cleveland powers a tank in France. The bullet pressed in Denver ends a charge in Burma. The Liberty ship launched in Portland carries food to Moscow. Freedom is no longer a philosophy. It's a supply chain. And the price of keeping that chain alive is $800 billion, the most expensive miracle in history. The U.S. didn't just fight a war. It built one, piece by piece, shift by shift, light by light. When tyrants conquered by fear, democracy conquered by flow. And that flow never stopped. The story most people tell begins with fire. Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. Battleships burning, sailors scrambling, and a stunned America waking to war. It's a dramatic image, but it hides a deeper truth. America wasn't asleep that morning. It had already begun building the machine that would destroy tyranny, quietly, systematically, a year before the first bomb fell. In 1940, while Europe burned, Franklin D. Roosevelt stood at a microphone and spoke 12 words that changed history. "We must be the great arsenal of democracy." The speech wasn't a declaration of war. It was a declaration of manufacturing. Within weeks, factories began retooling. Civilian car plants dismantled their assembly lines to prepare for something that didn't yet exist: a war economy. By the summer of 1941, Ford engineers were designing aircraft parts instead of bumpers. General Motors was drawing up tank chassis instead of sedans. RCA was developing radar instead of radios. Before Pearl Harbor, 60% of U.S. factories were already on defense contracts. The sleeping giant wasn't asleep. It was warming up its engines. America's greatest weapon wasn't surprise. It was readiness. While Hitler's Germany had perfected short bursts of conquest, America was perfecting long-term continuity. Roosevelt's advisors, led by Donald Nelson and William Knudsen, both industrial titans, built a plan so audacious it bordered on fantasy. Convert the largest peacetime economy in history into a total war production network in less than 2 years. It worked. The War Production Board, WPB, established in January 1942, didn't just organize factories, it rewired capitalism itself. Civilian cars were banned. Nylon stockings vanished. Their material turned into parachutes. Typewriters became machine gun mounts. Refrigerators became aircraft fuel pumps. Everything was repurposed. Nothing was wasted. While the Axis dreamed of blitzkrieg, the United States created masskrieg, war by multiplication. A new kind of economy emerged, one where blue-collar workers became soldiers of steel and the dollar became a bullet. By the time Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, America already had contracts for 60,000 aircraft and 45,000 tanks. The first Liberty ship had been launched. The first assembly line for bombers was complete. The myth of the sleeping giant hides a far more terrifying truth for the Axis. America didn't wake up angry. It woke up ready. The shock of Pearl Harbor wasn't the beginning of American war power. It was its ignition point. The machine had been waiting. And now, it would never stop. In 1940, the United States had an economy built for comfort, not conflict. A family car rolled off Detroit's lines every minute, but a tank? None. A shipyard could build a freighter in 9 months, but a destroyer? Never. Factories made refrigerators, radios, and toys, not weapons. Yet by 1945, that same economy had become the most fearsome engine of production in human history. How did a nation of consumers become the workshop of the free world? With a plan, one that cost the modern equivalent of $800 billion. The blueprint began inside the White House in a smoky room filled with industrialists instead of generals. President Roosevelt called them dollar-a-year men, executives from Ford, GM, DuPont, General Electric, and Boeing, who left their salaries behind to manage the war's biggest experiment, turning capitalism into command economy. Their first rule: if it moves, build more of it. The War Production Board took control of every resource: steel, copper, rubber, oil, food, textiles. By 1943, more than 70% of all industrial output in America was war-related. Civilian goods almost vanished. There were no new cars, no washing machines, no commercial planes. Every ounce of raw material went to something that fought, fueled, or fed. Factories became ecosystems. Ford's Willow Run plant produced a B-24 bomber every 63 minutes. General Motors' Cadillac division made tank engines by the tens of thousands. Goodyear built blimps and fighter tires. Even Coca-Cola became a military supply chain, bottling millions of rations for troops overseas. The scale was biblical. Between 1942 and 1945, the United States built 300,000 aircraft, 100,000 tanks, 2.6 million trucks, and 124,000 ships. If it could fly, roll, or float, it came from somewhere between Detroit and Los Angeles. The plan also extended to infrastructure. The U.S. built more than 2,500 airfields, 35,000 miles of new rail lines, and entire shadow factories, plants built secretly beside existing ones, to double capacity, without the enemy ever knowing they existed. The entire economy became a living circuit, designed not for profit, but for throughput. Every factory fed another. Every product had a destination. Every worker had a role. The scale of investment was matched only by its speed. The U.S. spent more money on war production between 1941 and 1945 than it had in its entire previous history combined. Yet remarkably, it didn't collapse the economy. It expanded it. Unemployment vanished. Wages doubled. Women entered the workforce by the millions. The Great Depression ended, replaced overnight by full industrial mobilization. This was the true miracle of the $800 billion blueprint. It didn't just build weapons. It built momentum. While the Axis engineered miracles of precision, America engineered miracles of repetition. And by the time the bombs began to fall over Europe and the Pacific, the United States had already built something greater than an army, a civilization that could manufacture victory. The war machine was alive, and its heartbeat was the American factory. Between 1941 and 1945, the United States spent the equivalent of $800 billion waging war, roughly $1 out of every $2 spent by every nation on Earth combined. It was the single greatest act of production, organization, and logistics ever attempted by a civilization. But to understand its power, You have to understand its math. In 1942, America was spending $250 million every day on the war. Every sunrise brought 24 ships launched from coastal yards, 8,000 trucks built per shift, 1,000 aircraft engines forged every 24 hours, 25 million meals packaged and shipped to soldiers around the globe. Every 20 minutes, another factory reached full capacity. By 1944, U.S. production exceeded that of Germany, Japan, and Italy combined by 300%. The numbers border on the mythic. Steel, 89 million tons in 1943 alone, more than the entire Axis output. Oil, 200 million barrels a year. Electricity, enough to power every nation in Europe simultaneously. Rubber, 800,000 tons, grown, refined, and shipped through synthetic plants built from scratch. Even the sky had a schedule. By mid-1944, one American airplane left a factory floor every 5 minutes. What made it possible wasn't size, it was synchronization. The War Production Board mapped every bolt, bearing, and bullet into a continental logistics system. One part built in Kansas fit perfectly into an engine made in Connecticut, which fit into a bomber assembled in California, which was fueled in Louisiana and flown from England. The Allies didn't just fight on multiple fronts, they fought with one system, and that system's scale defied physics. Each bomber consumed 2,500 gallons of fuel per mission. Each convoy of Liberty ships burned 1,000 barrels of oil a day. By 1944, the U.S. Army was burning more gasoline in Europe each week than the entire German military had access to in a month. To feed that appetite, the U.S. built 65 new refineries, 500 synthetic fuel plants, and a global pipeline stretching from Texas to Tehran. Even food became logistics. America didn't just feed its own soldiers, it fed its allies, refugees, and prisoners of war. 40% of the world's calories flowed through the U.S. supply chain. The average American farm was producing 30% more than before the war, even with half its men gone to fight. This wasn't just mobilization, it was metabolism. The U.S. economy had turned into a biological system, converting raw material into movement, movement into firepower, and firepower into survival. Every hour, every train, every assembly line added one more pulse to the organism. The Axis regimes were brilliant, ruthless, efficient, but they were small. The United States was infinite. Because when tyranny tried to control everything, democracy learned to coordinate everyone, and coordination at this scale was invincible. This was the economy of total war, where money wasn't spent, it was transformed. Every dollar was a bullet, every shift a sortie, every worker a weapon, and $800 billion was enough to drown tyranny under the weight of its own inefficiency. By 1943, the U.S. war machine had grown too large to measure. It was no longer a collection of factories. It was an ecosystem, feeding itself, feeding allies, feeding an entire planet under siege. The phrase arsenal of democracy wasn't propaganda anymore. It was a literal description of how the world survived. On the docks of New York, convoys stretched for miles, freighters, tankers, Liberty ships, each loaded with the essentials of modern survival: food, fuel, trucks, medicine, bullets, and boots. Every vessel that left port carried a piece of America's anatomy across the ocean. Each convoy to Britain meant 100,000 tons of cargo. Each to Murmansk, 60,000 tons of life threaded through Arctic storms and submarine traps. Every week, hundreds of ships left American ports, and hundreds arrived at foreign ones. The world had never seen anything like it. And it wasn't just steel and ammo, it was bread. From Kansas wheat to Iowa pork to California fruit, America fed the armies of 38 nations. At its peak, U.S. agriculture produced more food than the entire Axis combined. 130 billion pounds of meat, 7 billion pounds of dried milk, 16 billion pounds of flour, Canned goods and powdered rations replaced fresh harvests. Innovation born from necessity. K rations were designed for paratroopers and Marines, compact and calorie-dense. Spam became a global phenomenon, shipped to Britain, Russia, and the Pacific Islands alike. A British soldier joked, "We may lose the war, but we'll never run out of spam." But logistics was no joke. It was the bloodstream of freedom. The Liberty ship became its red blood cell. Built in 42 days, crewed by 44 men, each could carry 10,000 tons across the Atlantic. In just 4 years, America built 2,700 of them, one every 20 hours. The cost was $2 million apiece, but their value was measured in continuity. Each one replaced what the U-boats sank. The Germans called them the ships that sink too slowly to matter. That was the genius of the system. Not indestructibility, but replaceability. If a ship was lost, another was waiting. If a truck broke down, a replacement was already crossing the ocean. If an airfield ran out of fuel, a convoy was 2 days away. The U.S. didn't just supply its armies, it supplied every army. The British received 200,000 vehicles, the Soviets 14,000 aircraft, the Chinese 2.5 million tons of aid. The logistics network spanned from Alaska to Iran. The Persian corridor carried oil to the Red Army. The Burma Road fed Allied troops in Asia. The Pacific Island chains became stepping stones of storage, each base another warehouse floating in salt water. It was war as an equation. Resources multiplied by speed, divided by distance, equaling survival. No other nation in history had ever fed a global conflict while fighting one. When American soldiers ate breakfast in Normandy, their eggs had come from Wisconsin, their butter from Ohio, their salt from Louisiana, their steel mess kits from Pennsylvania. When British troops marched into Holland, they did it in boots stamped "Made in Massachusetts." The American home front didn't just support the war. It became the war. Factories were fronts. Farmers were quartermasters. The kitchen table was as strategic as any battlefield. Because in the new logic of total war, calories were as decisive as bullets. And by 1944, the United States was feeding freedom faster than tyranny could eat. By 1943, the Axis powers were no longer fighting just the Allies. They were fighting arithmetic. Every tank, every aircraft, every rifle the Germans and Japanese built required steel, oil, and men. The Americans had more of all three. Every month, the gap widened until no calculation could close it. Hitler's empire had been designed for lightning war, short, decisive, and cheap. But by 1943, the war had become the opposite, slow, grinding, and infinite. Germany's economy could not breathe in such an atmosphere. Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, was a genius of efficiency. He squeezed output from bombed factories, moved production underground, cut waste, and reorganized labor. Yet his math had no answer for what America was doing. In 1944, Germany built 40,000 aircraft, an impressive number. The United States built 96,000. The difference wasn't engineering, it was oxygen. By that same year, Allied bombers were dropping 250,000 tons of explosives on German targets every month. Speer later admitted, "We were producing in a vacuum. We had machines without power, fuel without transport, and men without hope." The oxygen of war, mobility, was gone. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, could barely take off. Fuel shortages grounded squadrons. Training flights were cut to minutes. Even Hitler's new miracle weapons, the Me-262 jet, the V-2 rocket, arrived too late, built by hand in caves without oil to test them. In Japan, the story was even worse. American submarines strangled sea lanes. Oil imports from the Dutch East Indies vanished. Aircraft sat idle on airstrips, their tanks empty, their pilots reduced to suicide attacks. By 1945, Japan had more planes than fuel to fly them. Tyranny had run out of air. Meanwhile, the Allied flow grew faster. Convoys multiplied. Trains crossed continents. the sky filled with bombers. The U.S. Army burned 15 million gallons of fuel a day, more than the Axis had left in reserve. Every calculation favored momentum. German generals began to say it aloud. "We are fighting a machine." They were right. The U.S. war machine was no longer a metaphor. It was a literal organism. It consumed raw material and exhaled destruction. And it operated faster than human command. The more the Axis optimized, the faster they collapsed. They had bet on control. The Allies bet on flow. When Allied bombers leveled the oil plants at Perlitz and Leuna, Speer ordered decentralized fuel production. But decentralized systems need coordination, and coordination requires time, the one resource America had stolen. By late 1944, the German army moved on foot. Tanks became bunkers. Planes became shelters. The U.S. had transformed war into a supply chain so efficient that the enemy no longer died by bullets. It died by delay. This was collapse math, when logistics, not soldiers, decide the outcome. The Axis built machines of conquest. The Allies built systems of persistence. And persistence always outlives perfection. By 1945, tyranny had no air, no motion, no future. The machine of democracy was still accelerating. Michigan, 1943. The snow outside lies thick and silent, but inside the Willow Run plant, it's thunder. A cathedral of aluminum and fire stretching more than a mile long. Conveyor belts hum like arteries. Cranes crawl through the rafters. And on the ground, thousands of men and women move in perfect rhythm. Every 63 minutes, a B-24 Liberator bomber rolls out of the far end of the line. Not one a day, not one a week, one every hour. This was Ford's ultimate experiment. Could the same assembly line logic that built cars for families build bombers for freedom? Henry Ford had doubted it at first. Airplanes were too complex, too delicate, too handcrafted. Each B-24 had 1.5 million parts, 550,000 rivets, 9 miles of wiring. But Ford's engineers and thousands of women workers who had never seen a plane before turned it into choreography. They called it mass production with wings. At its peak, Willow Run employed 100,000 people, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The night shift was larger than the German Luftwaffe's entire maintenance corps. Lines of women-fitted engines, welded frames, painted fuselages. Many had never used a wrench before the war began. Rosie the Riveter wasn't propaganda. She was real. One of 19 million women who entered the U.S. workforce during the war. Inside Willow Run, time was measured in minutes per bomber. By 1944, they'd reduced it from a week to just 55 minutes. The numbers are surreal. 8,700 B-24s built at Willow Run, 276,000 parts produced daily, 13 miles of conveyors, 1,000 subcontractors feeding the line from 32 states. Each aircraft that rolled off the line carried 4 CALM 200 horsepower engines, a crew of 10, and the strength to carry 8,000 pounds of bombs across an ocean. But Willow Run was more than a factory. It was proof of concept. It proved that democracy could organize itself with the precision of tyranny and outproduce it. While Germany hand-built its Tigers and Me-262s, America built bombers like breakfast cereal. The U.S. didn't have the most advanced designs, but it had velocity. A Willow Run bomber was never the fastest, strongest, or most beautiful, but there were always more of them tomorrow. And that was the defining logic of American victory. Repetition over refinement. Even the factory itself was designed for momentum. The final assembly line was shaped like a giant letter L, because a straight runway that long would have crossed the county line, forcing Ford to pay taxes in 2 jurisdictions. That detail says everything about the American system. Efficiency wrapped in practicality, precision powered by improvisation. At Willow Run, war became math. Every worker knew it. 1 hour equals 1 bomber, One bomber equals one city saved. One city saved equals 1 day closer to peace. By the war's end, those equations added up to history's largest air fleet. Every B-24 that left the runway carried a signature of human rhythm, the sound of machines, hands, and faith moving as one. It wasn't just engineering. It was belief in multiplication, and no tyrant could match that. The North Atlantic, 1943, steel-gray water, endless waves, and above them, the slow heartbeat of propellers. Dozens, hundreds, thousands of them. Convoys stretched across the horizon like chains of moving islands, each carrying a fragment of America's industrial bloodstream. Every day, this floating factory line crossed oceans under constant threat. The enemy wasn't just submarines. It was math, distance, time, attrition. The U.S. had to deliver millions of tons of supplies faster than Germany could destroy them. The solution was the Liberty ship, the simplest, ugliest, most decisive vessel ever built. Designed in 1941 by industrialist Henry Kaiser, each ship carried 10,000 tons of cargo. It wasn't fast, it wasn't armored. It didn't need to be. Its purpose was pure volume. The first took 244 days to build. By 1943, the same design was launched in just 42. The record? The SS Robert E. Peary, welded, outfitted, and launched in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. It wasn't shipbuilding anymore. It was mass production at sea. Each Liberty ship carried the bones of war: tanks, trucks, munitions, food, even locomotives. They were painted dull gray, often manned by civilian crews, and armed with a single-deck gun. But their power was in replacement, not survival. If one sank, another was already crossing the Atlantic. Between 1941 and 1945, 2,710 Liberty ships were built, enough to move 120 million tons of cargo. The convoys they formed became arteries feeding every front: Britain, North Africa, Italy, the Pacific. Each convoy followed a brutal rhythm: sail for 20 days. Dodge torpedoes, deliver cargo, turn back empty, repeat. The Battle of the Atlantic wasn't a duel. It was an equation. The Allies built ships faster than the Axis could sink them. For every U-boat kill, 5 more hulls entered service. Germany's Admiral Karl Dönitz warned Hitler, "We are being buried under tonnage." He wasn't wrong. In 1942, Allied losses peaked. 7 million tons sunk. But by mid-1943, the tide turned. Escort carriers, radar, and code-breaking tore open the wolf packs. American destroyers hunted submarines with precision. By the end of that year, the math was absolute. 120 U-boats lost, 400 Liberty ships delivered. Each ship carried not just steel, but civilization. Food for Britain, ammunition for Russia, fuel for Africa, and hope for Europe. The convoys were unity made physical. Ships built in Maine carried engines built in Ohio, piloted by sailors from Texas, carrying food from Kansas to soldiers from London and Moscow. The ocean became an industrial belt stretching from the Great Lakes to the North Sea. And like all great American systems, it ran on continuity. A Liberty ship didn't need to be perfect. It just needed to arrive. When one reached Liverpool, it unloaded its cargo directly onto trains. Within hours, its contents were already at the front. No pauses, no bottlenecks, no glory. Just flow. The convoy system was democracy in motion. Coordination instead of command. Cooperation instead of control. By 1944, America's floating assembly line had delivered so much cargo that the front lines in Europe no longer depended on local production at all. Factories could burn. Railways could collapse, but the ocean still moved. That was the triumph of the system. The ocean wasn't a barrier anymore. It was a conveyor belt of freedom. And when tyranny tried to stop it, it drowned under the math. By May 1945, the world stood among ruins. Cities turned to powder. Empires reduced to silence. But across the Atlantic, the lights of America still burned. The same hum that had powered bombers and tanks now powered tractors and trains again. The war machine was shutting down, but not turning off. The $800 billion America had spent didn't vanish into smoke. It had built something larger than victory. It had built infrastructure for a civilization. Factories that once made bombers now made cars. Shipyards that forged liberty ships now built cargo vessels for peace. Electronics labs that designed radar became the birthplace of television and computing. The machinery of survival had become the machinery of progress. No empire in history had ever fought a global war and come out richer. But the United States did. GDP doubled. Industrial capacity tripled. The same systems that fed armies now fed markets. Tyranny had burned itself out chasing perfection. America had won by mastering continuity. When Hitler dreamed of a 1,000-year Reich, his factories couldn't last 5 under pressure. When Japan sought divine victory through sacrifice, its oil tanks ran dry. They had built weapons of terror. The U.S. had built systems of endurance. The $800 billion wasn't just money. It was motion. It bought 300,000 aircraft, 100,000 tanks, 124,000 ships, 2.6 million trucks. But more than that, it bought something intangible, the rhythm of endless replacement, the ability to move faster than collapse. That rhythm became the defining sound of modern power. The low hum of generators, the hiss of fuel lines, the steady beat of production. By the end of the war, 40% of all goods made on Earth came from American factories. The U.S. didn't outfight tyranny. It outproduced it into extinction. Every dollar had become a weapon, every worker a soldier, every factory a front line. And that fusion, capitalism turned into coordination, proved stronger than any ideology, any army, any dictator. Even Albert Speer, the architect of Germany's armaments miracle, admitted it. They defeated us not with strategy, but with organization. Their factories were invincible. The $800 billion that crushed the Axis also rewired the world. It created a permanent military-industrial complex, a new economic order, and a model of power that would define the next century. War had ended tyranny, but it had also built something enduring, a civilization that could project force anywhere, anytime, indefinitely. That's the legacy of the war machine. It didn't just win battles. It defined what winning meant. When peace returned, the world expected the noise to stop, the machines to cool, the factories to empty, the lights to dim. But they never did. America's war machine simply changed direction. The belts kept moving, the furnaces kept burning, the engineers kept designing. The purpose had shifted, but the rhythm remained. The arsenal of democracy had become the foundation of modern civilization. The same supply chains that built tanks now built tractors. The same aviation plants that forged bombers now produced airliners. Radar engineers laid the groundwork for microwave ovens and early computers. Mass production, logistics, and standardization, born in fire, had become the DNA of the post-war world. The miracle wasn't that the U.S. had spent $800 billion to defeat tyranny. The miracle was that it could spend that much and still rise stronger. No other nation in history had converted destruction into acceleration. In Europe, factories lay buried under rubble. In Asia, cities were erased. But in America, production never stopped long enough to reset. The assembly lines that ended tyranny built the consumer age. The same precision that armed soldiers would soon fill living rooms with refrigerators, radios, and televisions. The war had proven a law of modern power. Whoever controls flow of oil, steel, food, and ideas controls history. Tyranny was static. It could not adapt. But democracy, messy and imperfect, could pivot, scale, and evolve. That's what the $800 billion really bought: adaptability. The power to turn bullets into blueprints, bombers into cargo planes, and wartime discipline into peacetime abundance. Even the soldiers who came home brought the system with them. The GI Bill sent 7.8 million veterans to school, many to study engineering and science. They became the architects of the jet age, the space race, the digital revolution. The war machine had fed the free world. Now it would feed the future. By 1946, the United States was producing half of the planet's goods, 60% of its oil, and nearly all of its aviation fuel. The economy of survival had evolved into the economy of dominance. But beneath the triumph lay a question that would haunt every generation after. What happens when the machine no longer has an enemy? Because systems built for war don't retire. They transform. The hum of the factories never really went away. It just changed pitch. It became the sound of jet engines, rockets, computers, and global trade. The $800 billion that once bought bombs now underwrote the peace that followed, a peace built not on silence, but on motion. When tyrants fell, America inherited their void and filled it with production, precision, and flow. That is how democracy won, not through destruction, but through continuity. The lights that never went out in 1944 never went out again. Because once a civilization learns how to build forever, it never stops.